Good evening. I'm Steve Millis, Professor of Public Theology and Director of the Bernardin Center, and it is my privilege to welcome you on behalf of everyone at Catholic Theological Union. Catholic Theological Union is a graduate school of theology and ministry located in Chicago's beautiful Hyde Park neighborhood, close to the University of Chicago and the shores of Lake Michigan. We've been training candidates for priesthood and lay ministers for service to the church and the world since 1968. All of our courses and degrees are offered in person here and fully online. If you'd like to learn more about our offerings, about CTU, or about the programming we do in the Bernardin Center, please visit our website, www.ctu.edu. I want to say that we all hope to welcome at least some of you in person tonight at our Hyde Park facility to show you some hospitality and to let you buy a copy of Greg Hillis's book while the author is in the room to sign it for you. But due to some scheduling and other complications, that was not to be. And so we're here tonight at this fully online event. We do want to encourage you, though, to purchase the book. And so we're putting a link into the chat now that will take you to a local bookseller here in Chicago, an independent bookstore that CTU works with for events like this one. But you also can buy a copy directly from the publisher, Liturgical Press, by visiting www.litpress.org. In a moment, I'll invite our author to offer some remarks about his new book. But first, some housekeeping. Please take a moment right now and be sure your microphone is muted so that there are no accidental disruptions of tonight's presentation. After Greg's remarks, he'll take some questions from you. You can put those questions into the chat throughout the presentation if you'd like, and I'll pose them to Greg during the Q&A. But if you'd like to ask a question yourself at that point, please press the raise hand button, and I'll find you and call on you as soon as I can. So those are the rules of the road, and now we're ready to get underway. Gregory K. Hillis is Professor of Theology at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky. He's a member of the International Thomas Merton Society, and he's published articles and essays on Merton in Cistercian Studies Quarterly, the Merton Annual, and the Merton Seasonal, as well as in America Magazine and the Tablet. As a general rule, if you don't find him engaged in his teaching or scholarship or visiting the Abbey of Gethsemane, you're likely to find him enjoying a strong cup of coffee, taking in a Blue Jays game, or posting dog pictures on Twitter. And I can say all that because above everything else, Greg's a good friend. And we're glad to be able to congratulate him tonight and to help him introduce his new book to you, Man of Dialogue, Thomas Merton's Catholic Vision, from Liturgical Press. Greg, welcome and congratulations. The virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you to the Bernardin Center for inviting me. Again, I wish I could be with you in person tonight, but I think an online forum, there's one thing we've learned through the pandemic, an online forum actually works pretty well. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Steve and for Peter and for the work of the Bernardin Center, and I've been lucky enough to be part of the Common Ground initiative in the past, which I think is, as you'll see from the work that I've done on Thomas Merton, pushes or is involved in initiatives for the church in terms of dialogue that I think are absolutely vital for the future of the church and frankly for the future of our society and civilization. So if you're not familiar with the Common Ground initiative, I would suggest that you get familiar with it and come to understand a little bit about what they're doing. Thank you all for joining tonight. I'm really impressed by the number of people who are interested in hearing about the work that I do. And so I thought what I would do for the time that I have tonight to talk to you about my book is tell you a little bit about how I got interested in Merton, what it is that I find particularly compelling about him, then look at the question of Merton's Catholicism and what it is that I'm really trying to argue in my book. And I'll sort of go through some of the key arguments of the book. And then what I want to do is draw some, I'll conclude by drawing some lines of connection between Merton's understanding of Catholicism and Pope Francis's understanding of Catholicism. Because, well, in no small part, the book is as much about what I think Catholicism is as it is about what Merton thinks Catholicism is supposed to be. So I'm a professor of theology and religious studies at Bellarmine University, and I'm currently in my office right now. And about 50 feet away from me, that direction, is the Thomas Merton Center. The Thomas Merton Center is the official repository of Thomas Merton's literary estate. He established it in the 1960s, and from 1967 forward, in fact, he established the Thomas Merton Legacy Trust, not knowing that he was going to die a year later, making Bellarmine University the official repository of everything that he ever did. There are collections elsewhere, but this is the most extensive collection that there is. The fact that I am currently sitting in a room about 50 feet away from everything that Merton ever wrote and drew and all that is something of, I don't use the word lightly, but it's a bit providential. When I was 23 years old, I was in the midst of doing a second undergraduate degree, because I'm apparently a glutton for punishment. And I decided that I wanted to do a second undergraduate degree, and I wanted to become an academic. I felt like that would be something that I would really love to pour myself into. And so as I started my second undergraduate degree, though, I started to have real questions about whether I wanted to do this job or not, whether the academic life was one that I really felt called to or not. And I know that it's not the same as a lot of other crises that people have, but it was a crisis of vocation. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and everything that I had up to that point poured everything into. It seemed to be crumbling around me. That Christmas, over the Christmas holidays, as I was mulling over my future, and of course I'd just been freshly, newly married, so that added an extra layer to my vocational crisis. Not that I was in a crisis about who I married or anything like that, but it just added a little bit of pressure in terms of what I was going to do with my life. And I happened to have a copy of The Seven-Storey Mountain on my bookshelf. I don't remember how I have had that copy, and I really didn't know much about Thomas Merton at all, but I decided I was going to read it over the Christmas holidays. And while I think the book has tremendous weaknesses, which we can talk about later if you're interested, the book hit me squarely between the eyes, because many of you have read The Seven-Storey Mountain, I'm sure, and you know that the book is in large part about a vocational crisis. Thomas Merton, it's not just about his conversion to Catholicism. A huge part of the drama of The Seven-Storey Mountain revolves around whether he is really called to be a priest and a monk or not. And it's tremendously difficult for him. He finds himself in tears regularly. He is finding the whole thing incredibly difficult. And when finally he enters into the monastery, what he calls the four walls of my new freedom, I breathed a sigh of relief. It brought to me a tremendous amount of comfort to know that somebody's vocational crisis was resolved. And it brought me some sense of hope that my own vocational crisis would be resolved. And spoiler, I am an academic. So that all ended up happening. I'm in an academic office right now and all that. And so I started reading everything I could of Thomas Merton's, and I was particularly attracted to his private journals. They remain for me, I think, some of his best writing. I love going through his private journals, and I just spent hours going through them. And in fact, I kept a journal at that time. I still do keep a journal, and my journal at that time is filled with photocopies of pages from Merton's journals that seemed to speak to me at that particular time. And in what I can really only call a fit of youthful exuberance, I got a tattoo of a drawing that Merton did. It's a drawing of a monk. It's on my shoulder right here. My kids call it Tom. He did a lot of drawing. He did a lot of art, usually ink drawing. The Merton Center has over 1,000 pieces of his art up in the archives. And so, yeah, I got this drawing of a monk that has now been on my body for almost 25 years. Well, I lost touch with Merton while I was in grad school doing my master's and PhD. I focused my attention on Augustine of Hippo in my master's degree, and then Cyril of Alexandria and his Trinitarian theology during my PhD. But as I started applying for jobs, there was one job in particular that stuck out to me, and it was this job at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky, because I knew about Bellarmine University. In fact, the thing that I tell my students continually is that when I travel and I tell people I'm at Bellarmine University, they don't know Bellarmine University for its nursing program or for its business school or for all the other great things that we have at Bellarmine. They know about Bellarmine University because of Thomas Merton. So I came down here for an interview, got an interview, and I made sure that I spent some time in the Merton Center because I wasn't sure I was going to get the job or not. And I wanted to see his journals. I wanted to see his journals in real life, those journals that had been so important to me when I was in my early 20s. And well, I guess here's another spoiler. I got hired, and now I've been here for almost 15 years. I continued to write for a little while about Cyril of Alexandria, but I got pretty tired of that and realized that it made all the sense in the world that I should start making use of the archives that are here at Bellarmine University to start working on Merton. Moreover, the Abbey of Gethsemane is only an hour's drive away from Bellarmine University and from my home. And I had become friends with a number of the monks down there, many of whom knew Merton. And I could talk to them about what Merton was like, the kind of person that he was as a teacher, as a spiritual director. And so really for the last 5 years, I've been devoting my attention to Thomas Merton. So how did I get to the topic of Thomas Merton's Catholicism and his Catholic identity? It happened really on a drive down to the Abbey of Gethsemane. I take my students down there. I teach a course on Thomas Merton almost every year, pretty much every year. And as part of that course, we go down to the Abbey of Gethsemane. We hang out with Brother Paul Quenin and a few of the other monks down there. We go to Merton's Hermitage. We spend some time in silence. We pray with the monks. And there are a number of people in Louisville who know that I do this. And Merton's Hermitage is not exactly an easy place to get to. You have to have permission to go there, and they have recognized in me their sort of key and their way into Merton's Hermitage. And so this guy, I don't even remember his name, just rang me up and said, "Hey, can I go down there with you sometime?" And I said, "Sure." So he came down there with me. Not a Catholic guy. I can't remember what his religious background was, but he asked me a question. I even remember where he was asking me the question. It was as I was turning on to the exit from 264 to Highway 65. And he said to me, "Well, Greg, how Catholic is Thomas Merton anyways?" And that wasn't the first time I had been asked that question. And I realized that I had been asked that question by a lot of different people from different perspectives. On the one hand, you have very traditionalist Catholics who like the Thomas Merton of the Seven-Storey Mountain, but are kind of wary of the Thomas Merton of the 1960s and especially late 1960s, when he was, in interreligious dialogue with those in Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam and Judaism. That really worries them. And so they usually ask me the question, well, how Catholic was he? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have those who maybe aren't Catholic at all, usually aren't Catholic at all, but they like Merton anyways, even though he was Catholic, and they kind of want some reassurance that he really wasn't all that Catholic, right? So they'll ask me the question, well, how Catholic was he, right? It's the same question, just with a different emphasis. And so this book really was born out of that question. How Catholic was he, and what defined his understanding of Catholicism? When I told the monks that I was working on this question, they were somewhat dumbfounded, because many of these guys lived with Thomas Merton. He was a Catholic monk who had devoted his life and taken vows to a monastery, was a priest, and they were like, well, how much more Catholic can you get, right, than being a cloistered monk in a Trappist monastery? But it remains a question, of course, that continues to emerge. So what I did in the book is I essentially went through Merton's life chronologically, which works pretty well, because in looking at Merton's life chronologically, you're able to go through it thematically. Through his life thematically, because there are different things that he emphasized as his life progressed. The first chapter, I look at Merton's conversion. So that's really all about the Seven-Storey Mountain and the first volume of his journals. And I look at what it was that compelled him to convert. And the theme that I draw on, the thing that comes to the fore continually, is his Eucharistic devotion, his understanding of what the Eucharist is and how the Eucharist binds us to Christ, and through the Eucharist we are bound to one another. It's that devotion to the Eucharist that is really behind Merton's calling to the priesthood, or his sense of calling to the priesthood. It's that devotion to the Eucharist that leads him to want to become a monk at the Abbey of Gethsemane in the first place. If you read his journals recounting the time that he was at the Abbey of Gethsemane on retreat in Holy Week, in the April Holy Week, just 8 months before he becomes a monk at the Abbey of Gethsemane, he writes about two things. One thing, he writes about the beauty of the landscape there, but he writes specifically about how much he admires a place that is so focused on the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The next chapter looks at Merton's ordination to the priesthood. And in that, I look at not only at his actual ordination and his ordination day, which is actually the cover of the book, is a picture of his ordination to the priesthood at the Abbey of Gethsemane. But I also look at the role that his priesthood played throughout his entire life. Merton was, as a priest in the Roman Catholic Church, somebody who said Mass really every single day from the moment he was ordained in 1949 until the day that he died in 1968. In fact, his very last journal entry on December 7th, 1968, recounts that he was going to the Church of St. Louis to say Mass for December 8th, the Assumption of Mary. His saying of Mass, the fact that he said Mass so often, this transformed his understanding of who he was as a priest, and also transformed his understanding of his relationship with the world and what his relationship to the world should be about. In that chapter, I also look at Merton's rather conservative liturgical views. He was at first very enthusiastic about the post-Vatican II changes to the liturgy, and gradually became grumpier about those changes that took place. And in fact, continued to say the Mass in Latin at the Hermitage. There's a recording of him chanting the Mass in Latin that he did a recording of himself. And his journals and letters are full of frustrations with how the liturgy turned out, how the liturgical reform turned out. That's something of a surprise, I think, for some people when they learned that about Merton. Those two chapters are really important ones, and I'm going to go a little bit more quickly through the other chapters. The third chapter looks at Merton as novice master. There are 12 volumes, thick volumes of Merton's talks that he gave to the novices. He was the novice master for 10 years. He prepared extensively for these, for the teaching that he did, and in fact, immersed himself fully in the tradition in ways that are quite remarkable, given that he was not a trained theologian. He had a real ability with languages, which allowed him to be able to engage with all kinds of writers from the church's history. And so he was teaching them about, for example, Syrian monasticism at a time when nobody was in the West was studying Syrian monasticism. He was quoting chapter and verse from Thomas Aquinas' Summa continually, and it's clear that he was deeply shaped by his reading of that text. Merton was somebody who was, his novice conferences demonstrate, was somebody who was deeply immersed in the tradition. I also, in the next chapter, look at Merton's devotion to Mary. He had what I think can be called a very strong but not fluffy relationship to Mary. It was a very earthy relationship to Mary. He wrote prayers to Mary continually throughout his life. He named his hermitage after Mary. Our Lady of Carmel is what he named the hermitage. And he had icons of Mary surrounding him at the hermitage, wrote poetry about Mary continually. In the fifth chapter, after I look at Merton's understanding of Mary, what I look at is his peace writings. He sometimes gets accused of being somebody who capitulated to the world at that time. Basically being somebody who was going along with the sort of wave of people who were advocating for peace when we were getting involved in Vietnam and in the midst of the Cold War. But if you read Thomas Merton's peace writings, you see that they are, again, deeply rooted in the tradition. Merton draws in his peace writings and in his anti-war writings on deeply on the church fathers, particularly looking at people like Origen, Tertullian, Maximus the Confessor. These are writers that he draws on continually, arguing not for a peace just for the sake of it, but because he felt like it was at the very heart of what what Christianity is all about. And unfortunately, his writings on peace remain lamentably relevant to this day. In the sixth chapter, I look at Merton's anti-racism essays, and look particularly at the theological sources that he draws on there. For him, it is the incarnation that makes racism such an abhorrent sin, that if we fail to see Christ in everybody, if we refuse to see Christ in any one person, particularly on the basis of their ethnicity or their race, Merton saw that as the gravest of sins. And his writings on race are some of the most powerful writings that he has written, and actually some of the most ignored. And these are writings that we need to pay more attention to. I wasn't going to write about Merton's relationship with the nurse in the summer of 1966. For those of you who are unaware of this, Merton went into Louisville for a back operation in the summer of 1966, and he fell in love with a nurse who was substantially younger than him. And they carried out a relationship for about 3 months over the summer of 1966. I wasn't going to write about that, but then Jerry Wills wrote an article for Harper's Magazine criticizing Merton for this relationship. And I felt, well, okay, I'm going to have to deal with this. You can read the chapter on your own and see whether I do justice to that event or not. My purpose was not to defend Merton. He didn't defend himself afterwards, but rather to draw attention to the fact that whatever may be the case in terms of how we would morally assess that relationship, it transformed him. And moreover, the very fact that we know about the relationship is due to the fact that Merton kept all references to the relationship in his private journals, which he knew were going to be published. There's a humility there. He wrote at one point, and I'm just paraphrasing, if I'm going to be known, I'm going to be known. The business with the Margie was her name. The business with Margie is going to have to be known as well. My foibles are going to have to be known. And so I deal with that in that chapter. And then the last two chapters are really about Merton's interreligious dialogue. And I do defend that, of course. And his interreligious and ecumenical dialogue, what I argue there is that Merton was not going against his Catholic tradition in embracing interreligious and ecumenical dialogue. Rather, his understanding of dialogue was actually rooted in his understanding of the Eucharist. That is, his celebration of the Eucharist, his understanding of the Eucharist, which is the very thing that is to bind us together. That Eucharist, he said, compels him, and it compels all Catholics to see in all people, whether they be Catholic or not, the presence of God. And this is what led him to realize that he needed to engage in this kind of dialogue, that the disunity and fractured nature, divisiveness that are part of human existence, Merton saw as a sin really against the Eucharist. And that what he was called to do was to do everything he could to attain to unity. Dialogue did not mean for him a watering down to the lowest common denominator. It meant respecting the other, differences and all, listening to the other, being willing to learn from the other, and engaging seriously in endeavoring to understand who they are and to articulate our own perspectives as we should. Merton said that this isn't something that we should be scared of. Rather, this is something that we do on the very Christian ground of love. And if we are scared to engage in something in love, which is really our own ground, is it because we are not sufficiently Christian, is what he said, right? I want to end by just talking a little bit and reading to you from the last couple of pages from the book, in which I talk about the relationship that I see between Pope Francis's understanding of dialogue and Pope Francis's understanding of Catholicism and what Merton himself had to say. On October 3rd, 2020, the vigil for the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, Pope Francis signed his social encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. Written and published in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, Fratelli Tutti focuses on the imperative of love and openness to others in a world that appears to be fracturing. Pope Francis begins the encyclical by bringing up the example of St. Francis of Assisi, specifically pointing to an episode in his life when he visited the Sultan in Egypt. Quote, Francis went to meet the Sultan with the same attitude that he instilled in his disciples. If they found themselves among the Saracens and other non-believers, without renouncing their identity, they were not to engage in arguments or disputes, but to be subject to every human creature for God's sake, end quote. Pope Francis praised his namesake for his, quote, openness of heart, which knew no bounds and transcended differences of origin, nationality, color, or religion, end quote. As I read the Pope's description of St. Francis, I could not help but think that Thomas Merton also exemplified precisely this kind of openness of heart, an openness that was firmly rooted in his own Catholic identity rather than opposed to it. There are those who are attracted to the early Merton of the Seven-Storey Mountain and its account of a man and a monk who portrayed Catholicism in glowing terms, depicted other religions and Christian traditions somewhat judgmentally, and described his entrance into the Abbey of Gethsemane as an escape from the influences of an evil and pernicious world. Many of those attracted to the early Merton are wary of the later Merton, who dove headlong into interreligious and ecumenical dialogue, and who opened himself up to a world that he had previously rejected. But as I have endeavored to demonstrate, the transformation of the early, more insular Merton to a monk open to the world and to others did not involve a repudiation of Catholic tradition, but rather a deepening understanding of and engagement with it. He came to understand, as Pope Francis is himself trying to teach Catholics today, that our faith, and particularly our understanding of the meaning of the Eucharist, calls us to a radical openness to others. So in closing, I just want to say that in some sense, this isn't just an apology for Merton's Catholicism. It's an apology for the Catholicism of Vatican II. It's an apology for the Catholicism of Pope Francis, both of which are coming under attack more frequently in the 21st century. And I think that any understanding of Pope Francis or of Vatican II, any thought that either of those are somehow opposed to the tradition of the church, Thomas Merton clearly illustrates how deeply intertwined they are with the church. So I am open to questions, and I hope that if you haven't bought the book, you are interested now in perhaps buying the book. Yeah, thank you.
Greg, thank you. One of the happy duties that I get as the host of an event like this is to be able to give voice to the applause that you would hear if we were gathered in a room together. And as I see the smiles and the nods as I say that, I know that I'm right. Thank you for really a very rich presentation and a book that I look forward. I was hoping to buy my copy tonight at CTU, but I'll have to do like everybody else and do business. We've got some questions coming in, and I want to get to them. I also want to remind you, you can press the raise hand button under reactions, and I can call on you that way. But I actually want to claim a privilege if I can. I have a question I'd like to ask you first, if that's all right. You know, you and I have talked a little bit, and we've been to Common Ground and Merton events together. But I don't know if I've ever mentioned my own vocational journey sort of began in 1997, reading The Gift of Peace by Cardinal Bernardine. And it ended in the days around September 11th, turning to and reading Seven Storey Mountain. And one of the things that strikes me in the way that you talked at the beginning, and then throughout your presentation, I think what we're talking about is Thomas Merton as a kind of a Rorschach test for contemporary, at least US Catholicism. But I think we could say something similar about Bernardine. And I could talk for a while about how I am pretty sure I could say Bernardine felt about that, because he lived in a time of polarization when he would have been aware, he was aware that that was happening. How Catholic is Cardinal Bernardine could be asked both ways. But do you have a sense, and maybe you don't, do you have a sense maybe about how Merton might have felt about his status as a Rorschach test in this polarized church that we live in now?
Yeah, he has some interesting things to say about that. And in particular, see, this is the benefit of me doing it in my office, is I get to just look over at a book here, and it's going to take me a second to find the section. But one of the things that he was very well aware of was the growing polarization that was happening in the church post Vatican II. He basically said, look, we've got a situation where there is, as he says, a hardening division between progressives and conservatives in the wake of the Second Vatican II, or of the Second Vatican Council. And he talks about how there is what he refers to as a sort of hermetic closedness that conservatives have to progressives, but also that same closedness that progressives have towards conservatives. And so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he says, the extreme conservatives seem to me to be people who feel themselves so menaced that they will go to any length in order to defend their own fanatical concept of the church. This concept seems to me to be not only static and inert, but in complete continuity with what is most questionable and indeed scandalous in the history of the church. And then he goes on and refers to those whom he refers to as the extreme progressives. He says, on the other hand, the refusal of the extreme progressives to pay any attention to any traditional teaching, which would give them a common basis for rational discussion with conservatives, is surely scandalous also, especially when it is allied with an arrogant triumphalism of its own, and when it simply ridicules all opposition. See, what Merton saw from both the extreme progressives and the extreme conservatives was a fundamental lack of love. Merton defined himself, in fact, earlier in that passage, this I'm reading from Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. He says, I would like to think, and I think this was how Cardinal Bernardine understood himself too. You correct me if I'm wrong, but he said, I would like to think I am what Pope John was, a progressive with a deep respect and love for tradition. Right. Yeah. And so I think Merton would be frustrated that he's being used as a Rorschach test, because what he actually is he is a figure who transcends easy labels, and we don't know how to deal with that. Catholics don't know how to deal with that. We want people to be in one camp or the other, and firmly in one camp or the other. Yeah. As they say on television, ripped from today's headlines, those lines from Merton. Yeah. Victor Puskas has a question here in the chat, and let me remind everybody to continue sending us those, or feel free to raise your hand too. But Victor asks, did Merton ever write about Vatican II's restoration of the permanent diaconate or the possibility of a married priesthood? He did not write about the permanent diaconate, as far as I am aware. He did write about married priesthood, and he actually came out in support of the idea of a married priesthood. He didn't himself think that he should get married. He thought that would be a disaster for him, not least because he was in a monastery, but there was that temptation in 1966. But he didn't see, he actually was part of a group of priests who were advocating for a married priesthood, but he doesn't actually write that much about it. He doesn't provide a sort of sustained argument as to why he thinks that would be good. I think he just thinks, well, he's aware, as so many of us are, that there is a tradition of married clergy within the Latin Rite Church, that there continues to be a tradition of married clergy within the Eastern Rite and in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And while I get all the arguments for priestly celibacy that are made, it seems to me that it seems to me that the time has come for a married clergy. But Merton himself referenced it, but he doesn't write that much about it.
Yeah. Marianne Michelet, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, has another question. Was what's been happening in the world a motivator behind why did it motivate you to write the book?
Yes, not so much what's been happening in the world as what's been happening in the church with the increasing polarization under Pope Francis. I'm one of those Catholics who really has a tremendous amount of respect and love for the theological acumen of Pope Francis, as well as a tremendous respect for the theological acumen of his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, who will probably go down as one of the greatest intellects ever to hold that particular office within the church. And so it's frustrating. It was and remains incredibly frustrating to me that we see people choosing sides on this, when neither man has actually done anything to warrant or even ask for that sort of choosing of sides. And so, Elizabeth Johnson, who's a theologian, a feminist theologian at Fordham University, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. I'm very grateful for all the people who wrote blurbs for my book. But I have to say that of all the people who wrote blurbs, she absolutely nailed what I was trying to do. She said, while focused with great insight on Thomas Merton, this book shines helpful light on the current tension about Catholic identity in the church. And so it's that particularly got to me. It's the willingness of so many people to refuse to allow their Catholicism to look something different than what they practice.
Yeah, or even allow it to penetrate their lives in such a way that could help them to look at the world in a different way. Our friend Ray Glennon, and we've got questions piling up here now, so I want to try to editorialize as little as possible, contrary to all of my human instincts. But Ray Glennon asks, could or how could, and this follows a train of thought, could or how could Merton's understanding of the Eucharist serve as the beginning of a bridge across a polarized church? Is that common ground? And I'd say really quickly, just editorial for the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, it sort of is actually. But what about Merton?
Yeah, I would like to think that Merton's understanding of the Eucharist could be seen as common ground, but the problem is that the very thing that is supposed to unite us has become the very thing that is dividing us right now. The liturgical wars that are currently happening within the Catholic Church are leading us away from each other, and the very purpose of the Eucharist itself is being compromised by human human sinfulness. I mean, I think there's no other way to put it than that. So I think that Merton was somebody who, with regard to those liturgical issues, he wasn't a fan, as I mentioned, of the liturgical changes. At the same time, he wasn't opposed to practicing them. He loved the introduction of concelebration, for example. And he also he wrote in his journal one time about Daniel Berrigan coming down to the monastery and to the hermitage and celebrating a mass that Merton quite liked, even though, in Merton's own words, it was, quote, really groovy, right? So this is I think this is a thing where Merton had a personal preference when it came to the liturgy, but was absolutely opposed to drawing judgment on anybody for the type of liturgy that they celebrated or that they found most meaningful.
I want to ask a follow-up question, even though I said I wouldn't. I'm not a theologian, but it's a follow-up on this question here that I'm not a theologian, as you know. I just play one for professional reasons. But it seems to me that I've read, and maybe you can comment on this, that there was a renewal of Eucharistic theology in the 30s.
Yes.
That involved that created a growing awareness of precisely this way you talk about Merton engaging with the Eucharist as that which is supposed to turn us toward the world and make us realize that we're all connected with each other. Can you just talk a little bit, as much for me, a fake theologian, as for everybody else, about maybe how that might have influenced Merton?
Well, I think he was influenced less by that movement and more by his own celebration of the Eucharist. And I couldn't help but see that Ray had a follow-up there. He was saying he wasn't so much talking about the liturgy as he was the very presence of Christ. And I think that if everybody can agree within the Catholic Church that that together, no matter how we celebrate the liturgy, we are bound to one another in and through Christ. That Christ becomes present in the Eucharist, whether we celebrate it in the Novus Ordo, or whether we celebrate it in the extraordinary form, is that Christ is present there. And you may not want Christ to be present in certain liturgies, but he's there. And so we're bound to one another as a result of that. I will say Merton was more influenced in his own theology by the Nouvelle Théologie movement, Henri de Lubac, the Ressourcement movement, Henri de Lubac, Jean Danelou, with whom he exchanged a number of letters. Jean Danelou was actually a spiritual director to him to some degree, but also Jacques Maritain, very influenced by Jacques Maritain, and Hans Urs von Balthasar, those sorts of figures.
So here's an ecumenical question from your old conversation partner, Catherine Johnson.
Oh.
Your focus on the Eucharist centrality, where we're still here, your focus on the Eucharist centrality from Merton emphasized how he found strength there for living openness to others. Can you help us think about moves toward Eucharistic communion itself as resting on this understanding of the Eucharist's place in Christian life?
So I have to say, Catherine is a really important person in my own life. She taught at the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary for many years. And here at Bellarmine, we had a program called the Master of Arts and Spirituality, which was an ecumenical program that we jointly hosted with Louisville Presbyterian Seminary. And I had the tremendous good fortune of co-teaching many classes with Catherine Johnson, and even taking a group of students to India together with Catherine. And Catherine's question comes out of her own tremendous work in the ecumenical movement with the World Lutheran Federation, where she has been a part of formal ecumenical dialogues here in the United States and internationally between the Lutherans and the Catholics on a number of issues, including, for example, the famous joint declaration on justification, but more recently on the Eucharist. and Lutheran Catholic understandings of the Eucharist. And I think Merton has something very important to say about that. I think that he wouldn't want us to go into a sort of flippant communion with one another. He wouldn't want there to be just sort of ad hoc, as it were, necessarily, although he himself participated in those. I think what he would want to see is precisely what Catherine and others have been endeavoring to do, that is to provide the theological and ecclesiological foundations by which we can once again enter into communion with one another formally, to embrace one another at one table. There's the unity that we share with one another ecumenically is rooted in our common baptism, and that we share the one Spirit, and that we are brothers and sisters in Christ through the Spirit that we receive. But it is painful to not celebrate the Eucharist together. And I will say that one of the best parts about going to India with Catherine was that one of the things that is really part of a number of canon lawyers' interpretation of canon law. So if you're a canon lawyer who disagrees with that, you need to talk to the canon lawyers I talk to, not me. But one of them is that when the canon law talks about communion being offered to non-Catholics only under grave circumstances, one of those grave circumstances is for a Protestant not to have access to their own sacraments, which in India, that was the case. And so for those 2 weeks, Catherine and I shared the table together, formally and unapologetically and beautifully. And that meant a tremendous amount to me.
That's a tremendous story. I loved hearing it. I want to maybe take one last question from James Cronin. And you just said something really profound, and I'm going to introduce this question by saying something stupid. But when I read the question the way it appears here on my screen, first, I thought the question asked, how Catholic is Professor Hillis? But in fact, happily, the question is not that. The question is, how Catholic was Thomas Merton? And the real question is Professor Hillis making a distinction between religiosity and religion? And he goes on to clarify, here I'm thinking about Merton's use of post-Christian and how religious rhetoric as religiosity was being used in the US during his lifetime to reinforce the Cold War binary. So, is it in fact Catholicism that we're talking about, or I guess, is it this representation of Catholicism that we sort of bandy around as a weapon or as an identifier, or however you like?
Yeah, no, it was, I would say that for him, to be Catholic was to be united around the one table of the Eucharist. The Eucharist has been politicized and has been used in flippant ways, and I guess in terms of justifying various things, I guess in the sort of broad label of religiosity. What I'm talking about is really in the deepest fiber of Merton's bones. He was deeply Catholic. He was shaped by that tradition. It formed him utterly and completely, and it was that Catholic tradition that then led him to be open to others, not closed to others, but open to others. So if I understand the question correctly, I am arguing not that he was sort of using Catholicism to sort of attain certain ends, but that he was doing certain things precisely because he was shaped by the Catholic tradition.
Well,
Thank
this is an opportunity for me now to say something that I like to say as often as possible, which is that I agree with Elizabeth Johnson. And that while this is certainly a book that invites us to draw into a deeper understanding and relationship with Thomas Merton, it remains the case that the issues with which Merton was confronted during his lifetime and which bloomed into the time that we all live in today, those issues are present in Merton's life as they're present in ours, and they're present in this book. And for all of that, Greg Hillis, I really thank you for what has been a rich conversation about a book I very much look forward to adding my collection and getting you to sign for me the next time we are happy enough to be together. For everything else, my dear friends, let me say this is the part of the program now where I would love to be able to gesture toward the buffet and encourage you to refresh yourself, to gesture you toward the book sales and the book signing, and to encourage you to have a conversation with the author and cue the musician to start again so that we could all have a nice evening together while we did all of that. That's not to be for this event, I regret to say, but we will get Greg at the CTU to do that, and hopefully many of you will be able to join us at some future time. For right now, let me remind everybody and let me ask my ever faithful and helpful Associate Director of the Bernadette Center, Peter Cunningham, to drop those 2 links to purchase the book into the chat one more time so that they'll be at the bottom. Let me urge everybody to pick up a copy of this wonderful book. Greg, do you want to say a last word before we let everybody go?
Just saying, I really want to thank everybody for joining. I'm really astounded by the number of people who were willing to listen to me tonight. And so I'm grateful, and I hope that I get to meet many of you in person at an event at CTU in the future.
Inshallah. All right. Excellent. Well, then, thank you, Greg, for all the work you've put into the book and for this presentation tonight. Thank you, everybody, for being with us for this conversation. Please, in all things, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll look forward to seeing you out in the world as soon as possible. So long now.